For nearly 3 years now, the worship services at Richmond's First Baptist Church have been planned around the weekly readings from the Revised Common Lectionary. When we began this practice, I told you that the lectionary was no more and no less than a plan for reading through most of the Bible over a 3-year period. Well, here we are, near the end of that first 3-year period, and some of you have noticed that we haven't read most of the Bible in public worship. There have been some Sundays when the readings seemed just too long and we omitted one or more. Other times when they really didn't seem to lift up the theme of the day, and so we dispensed with them. Other times when we set the lectionary aside altogether so that we could take up some other theme or some special Sunday. But there have been some times when the lectionary itself has let us down. Those of you who have been paying close attention in the last 3 years know that we have not read a single verse from 1 Chronicles. And I know you're disappointed. We haven't read anything from the prophet Obadiah or Nahum. I've had some complaints about that. Nothing at all from 2nd or 3rd John or the little New Testament letter of Jude. There's been an outcry. We need more Jude in our worship services. Well, not really. But you may have also noticed this, that in each of these 3 years we have emphasized a particular gospel. There is year A in the lectionary cycle when we emphasize the Gospel of Matthew and draw most of our readings from that good and honest gospel. Year B is Mark's year, and in year C we focus on readings from the Gospel of Luke. But then we start all over again. And some of you have wondered, where is year D? Where is John's year, the year of the 4th gospel, my favorite? The answer, of course, is that readings from John's gospel are sandwiched in among all those other readings from the other gospels throughout the 3-year lectionary cycle. But for some of you, it isn't enough. You want more John, and for you today, I have good news. For the next 4 Sundays, the lectionary is serving up 4 delicious passages from the Gospel of John. The one about Nicodemus coming to Jesus by night, the one about the woman at the well of Samaria, the man born blind from chapter 9, and then from chapter 11, the story of the raising of Lazarus. 4 of the tastiest passages in all the Bible served up just for your enjoyment over these next 4 Sundays. Good for you, good for me, good for us. I want to begin with this passage from John chapter 3, the story about Nicodemus coming to Jesus by night. And if you turn to chapter 3 and look at the first verse, this is what you learn about him. There was a Pharisee named Nicodemus, a leader of the Jews. A Pharisee. Some of you know all about Pharisees, or think you do. In our sermons and Bible studies, they are often the object of ridicule. And we say to people, even some of our closest friends, don't be such a Pharisee. But I want you to remember that the Pharisees were the most religious people of their time. They were zealous for righteousness. One scholar has said that the Pharisees were absolutely ardent in terms of keeping the law and wanting others to keep it. They wanted complete obedience to the law of Moses. Paul, in describing himself, says that, as for zeal concerning the law, I was a Pharisee. Pharisees also looked for the coming of the Messiah and believed that when he came, he would usher in God's eternal kingdom and that the righteous dead would rise again. It was that kind of expectation that kept them always looking for one who might be the Messiah. Nicodemus was a Pharisee, but he was also a leader of the Jews. New Testament scholar Raymond Brown says that this means almost certainly he was a member of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish religious council, like the Supreme Court in religious matters, determining whether or not someone had transgressed the law of Moses. And when someone was accused of blasphemy, that person would often come before the Sanhedrin. They also assessed the claims of would-be prophets to see if their prophecy came from the Lord or from somewhere else. The Jewish council met almost every day in the time of Jesus, and surely they met on the day Jesus turned over tables in the temple, when he chased out the money changers and emptied their boxes of coins, when he said, "My Father's house is meant to be a house of prayer. You've turned it into a den of robbers." Surely the Sanhedrin came together at the close of that day to discuss what had happened, to talk about this troublemaker from Nazareth named Jesus, and to wonder what they should do about him. They must have discussed it for a long time, but eventually decided that someone should pay him a visit. And I wonder, did they choose Nicodemus or did he volunteer? "Here am I, send me." He went to meet with Jesus by night, John tells us, and I've often wondered where he went. All of this was going on during the Passover festival. We know that sometimes when Jesus came to Jerusalem for Passover, he stayed at Bethany, presumably with his friends Mary and Martha and Lazarus. But there are biblical scholars who believe that Jesus sometimes spent the night with his disciples just across the Kidron Valley on the slopes of the Mount of Olives. They point to places that were used in those days by people who didn't have homes of their own, who slept wherever they could. Jesus said about himself once, "Birds of the air have nests, foxes have holes, the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." Sometimes, apparently, Jesus and his disciples slept over there, on the slopes of the Mount of Olives, not far from the Garden of Gethsemane. It would be like Monroe Park is here in the city of Richmond, a place of hospitality for homeless people where they sometimes spend the night. And I picture Nicodemus going there in search of Jesus. It would be as if some homeless person in this city had gotten a reputation for being especially wise concerning the things of God, someone with a deep spirituality whose teaching was regarded by many as being something wonderful to hear. I can picture the Richmond Baptist Association getting together, all the ministers in the Baptist churches in Richmond talking about this person, this homeless person who keeps teaching and preaching and who sets up his little ladder on the street corners, and people come and pay attention to what he says. What are we going to do about him? Is his teaching orthodox or not? Somebody should go and find out. And I would volunteer. "Here am I, send me." And sometime after the sun went down, I would go under the cover of darkness to Monroe Park looking for that person, whoever he was. And I might say to him what Nicodemus said to Jesus, "It's clear to us that you are a teacher sent from God. No one can do these remarkable things that you're doing without having God's presence with him." This is the sort of thing Nicodemus says to Jesus, but notice what Jesus says in reply. He says, "I'm telling you the truth, Nicodemus. You've got to be born again." There's a difference between what Nicodemus says and how Jesus answers that makes me think Jesus knew what was really on Nicodemus's mind. Right at the end of chapter 2 in John's Gospel, it says that Jesus knew about people. He knew what was in them, knew what they were thinking. I believe he knew what Nicodemus was thinking and what his real concern was. I believe that the question Nicodemus really wanted to ask was this one: "Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" But Nicodemus couldn't ask a question like that. He was a leader of the Jews. It would be like me saying to that homeless person in Monroe Park, "What must I do to be saved?" He would say to me, "What? Are you a PhD in New Testament? Are you the pastor of Richmond's First Baptist Church and you don't know this?" It would be too embarrassing to ask. And so you might come saying something else like, "My goodness, what a wonderful teacher you are. You really seem to be in touch with God's truth." Jesus hears the compliment, but he says to Nicodemus, "You've got to be born again." Do you know people like this? The most religious people you know who seem to be carrying on some sort of deep internal struggle, not certain that they have done enough or believed enough to be saved, always thinking maybe they could do more. And so they are always in church every time the doors open. Careful about their Bible study, their Sunday school attendance. They check the little boxes on their list to make sure they're doing all the things they need to do just to stay on God's good side. Because if it's true that in the end, when the final judgment comes, some will go to heaven and some will go to hell, they don't want there to be any doubt in God's mind about which way they should go. And so they struggle to prove themselves righteous.